Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is UCCS Speaker Series. I'm Richard Kravitz, the director here. We're pleased to continue with one of our 3 annual themes, which is today at least, technological solutions for addressing California's biggest problems. And there's really no bigger problem in California, at least acutely, than the housing shortage, which contributes to high prices, unaffordability, especially for young people trying to start out, and even homelessness as people experience an economic bump in the road and then find themselves out on the streets. But close behind another problem, and that's global warming and greenhouse gases, which leads to the question that sort of unites the 2 topics. How can we build not just more housing, but more of the right kind of housing that's sustainable and follows a path to home decarbonization? Well, that's the subject of today's talk, and I'm very happy that Ian Walker from Lawrence Berkeley Lab is here to help us be more informed. Dr. Walker is a scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory who has more than 30 years of experience as a building scientist, conducting research on indoor air quality, ventilation, and reducing the energy and carbon dioxide impacts of buildings. He's a fellow of the American Society for Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, and currently serves on their COVID-19 epidemic task force. I wish I had been introduced to Dr. Walker earlier, because one of my ancillary responsibilities as center director as this building was being designed was to try to pull in expertise on ventilation in order to reduce transmission of COVID-19 and other future respiratory viruses. I'm glad to say I have my CO2 checker, and in this building full of people, the number is under 500, which is pretty close to outside air. So good job for those engineers. Anyway, Dr. Walker works on standards and technical committees for multiple national and international organizations. His current work focuses on residential ventilation and home decarbonization, and that's what we'll hear about today. So please join me in welcoming Ian Walker.
What? Thanks very much. So yeah, I'll come back and talk about ventilation another day, but for now, let's stick to the topic at hand, which, thank you very much for that introduction. I was going to say some of those same things. We have a big challenge, right? This idea that somehow we're going to rapidly reduce our emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases is an interesting one to pursue. And I'm going to talk today about homes. It turns out homes are quite a lot of our emissions, particularly in California. We live in what I call a gassy state. In our homes, we burn a lot of gas. We do it for heating. We do it for hot water. We do it for clothes drying, almost more so than any other state. And I'm going to talk a little bit here about work that we've been doing at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in collaboration with other national labs in the country, international collaborators, people all over the world. So I'm going to present things that is not just work that I did with my team at LBL, just to be clear. But I just want to give you sort of a broad perspective of some of the things that are going on, some of the technologies that we're talking about developing, and also maybe think a little bit about some of the non-technological issues that we might be facing. So I want to start out with the question, what is a decarbonized home? And I guess it's pretty straightforward. We're going to commit to going all electric, basically. Our friends at Rewiring America have a phrase that says, we can't efficiency our way to zero, right? And by that, they mean you can't just put in a more efficient fossil fuel burning device and expect to get to zero. You won't get there. You're going to have to electrify. And a nice thing about California is, boy, we have a pretty good grid in terms of the CO2 content. It's not perfect, but we don't have to be perfect. It's pretty good. Electrifying homes will massively reduce our CO2 emissions. The question is, how might we get there? And why is it different from what we've been doing historically in buildings? And I want to spend a few minutes here just talking about some new and old ideas. We used to talk about energy efficiency. That's been my career. It's something that's been talked about a lot. But I think going forward, we're going to talk about something which I would call power efficiency, which is how much power does it take to do a certain thing? rather than how efficient you are at doing it. We're going to talk about things like maximum power. In other words, it's not just the average over a year, it's what was your biggest power draw? Because that determines a lot of things, like how many power plants do we have to build? What are the sizes of wires in the street? All that sort of thing. We used to talk about energy use, and I think that the biggest transition there is to go from energy use to looking at emissions instead, sort of as our metric of concern. I'll talk about CO2, but I mean all greenhouse gas emissions. And lastly, a big shift for those of us in the building industry. We always used to look at monthly bills. Everyone's familiar with getting a monthly bill, tells you the total for the month. Well, it turns out that that's not going to be good enough in the future. We're going to have to know which hours exactly were you using your energy, mostly because the CO2 content of our electricity changes with time. As you can imagine, during the day, when we have a lot more solar and wind power, low CO2, but at nighttime, we don't have very much sunshine. We have less wind. We're burning fossil fuels. So the time at which you use your energy is really going to matter a lot. There's a few other metrics that we're sort of in the process of developing. And the reason why I want to talk about this is if you want to form public policy, we sort of have to have some agreement about what are the important things and what are the new things we're going to talk about. If you're going to talk about building codes and standards, which is what I do a lot of work on, they have to include some of these things. And so things like carbon emissions rather than energy use. ResNet, by the way, for those of you that don't know, they are an energy rating organization that's swapping over to being a carbon emissions rating organization. It's actually used for rating a lot of new construction in the country, not so much in California, because we have an awesome energy code as it is, called Tile 24. We're going to talk about peak power, because I'll talk a little bit more about this topic, the cost related about upgrading or changing out all the electric panels and electric service in the state, which is a big problem. I put a question mark after embodied carbon because we've talked about it for years and we still don't really know exactly what to do with it. It turns out it's pretty squishy. The other stuff, less so. We can sort of figure out peak power in homes, but embodied energy in homes, man, it is an embodied carbon. It's a challenge. And so I'm going to skip that today just because it's too hard and I have limited time. We're going to talk about appliances have been energy efficiency rated for a long time. There's federal programs like Energy Star that says this is a bit more efficient refrigerator. Great. We want to talk about power efficiency. So it's not just how much energy it uses, it's how much power does it consume. We're going to have to think about in our building codes and standards and strategies for construction and strategies for energy efficiency programs that probably won't be called energy efficiency programs going forward. Things about how do we deal with on-site power and on-site storage? Currently, we kind of wave our hands. We don't really include them. That's not going to be good enough going forward. I mentioned this earlier, this idea of it's not just how much energy you use, but when you use it and getting the right signals to people. We'll talk a little bit that the acronym TOU means time of use, and it's talking about, do we charge you a different tariff depending on what hour of the day it is? There's all sorts of different TOU strategies being used here in California with our utilities and nationally, but do they actually align with what we want to do? And the last sort of new idea here is we've talked about things like return on investment, life cycle cost analysis, total resource analyses when we've tried to make our policies in the past. But when we're talking about people's homes, that's not in alignment with how people make household decisions. People think more about a term that I will loosely call affordability, which is, so what does this cost me every month, right? What is the net cost to me? There's a whole world of research on this topic, which I'm not going to have a chance to get into today, but this is an enormous change. For those of you familiar with how we set regulations in the state, they use these financial instruments that a bank would care about. But people are not banks, and people do not run their households like they run a bank. And so we have a big disconnect here. I want to give sort of a quick example here about things that might be happening in a house and how the idea of changing from an energy perspective to a power perspective might make things different. So if we look at things that use a lot of energy, that's the sort of high energy row there. We have electric vehicles and solar PV. They're also high power applications, many, many kilowatts. right? Typical EV charger is 7 kilowatts or more. Typical solar PV system in the state is something like 6 kilowatts. But we also have things that are relatively low power, but use a lot of energy. And these are heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, which are sort of some of our core strategies for electrification, because it's where all the CO2 is getting emitted, is those things. But relatively, they are low power. Similarly, we have things that don't use a lot of energy in your household, things like cookers and clothes dryers. But man, when you look at how many watts they use or the amperage rating on a breaker that has to be put in a panel, they're very, very high power applications, particularly cooking. And lastly, the last little bucket here is thinking about all the other stuff that might happen in a home. Tends to be not using that much energy, but also low power impact. And so when we are transitioning from thinking just about energy to thinking about power, things don't necessarily line up. And that sort of has important, how can I put it? It has important impacts on how we think about what our strategies going forward are. And to talk about strategies going forward, I'm going to blow past new construction. This is the only slide I'm going to talk about new construction here. And why is that? The little chart I'm showing there shows that the adoption nationally of energy codes here in California, we're about equivalent to the 2021 IC standard. We're building good new construction. It is really energy efficient. We're going to have a debate about how much energy it uses versus energy efficiency. You know, if you're building very, very big homes, even if they're efficient, they use a lot of energy. And then we maybe will have policies that set energy budgets, not energy efficiency budgets, but that's probably a discussion for another day. And also, it's cheaper to build all electric homes than it is to build dual fuel homes. Sometimes substantially cheaper, tens of thousands of dollars cheaper. The biggest problem that I hear from builders is we'll build electric homes all day long, but people want a gas cooker. And that gas cooking means now we've got to install that infrastructure. I'm not exactly sure how we'll fix that because people love their gas cookers. But that's why I'm not going to talk about new construction because it's great, basically. And it's been great for a long time. Here's someone who used to actually be in charge of the state, our friend Ronald Reagan, back in the 50s. This is not a new idea, right? The idea of an all-electric new home being a great thing is not new. It's very, very old. We just sort of gave up on that for a host of reasons I won't get into here. But anyway, let's spend the next, I'm looking at the clock, 35 minutes or so, talking about all the homes we already built. We kind of know what to do. This is the list of things we have to do. It looks pretty easy, right? The thing in the box is a bigger challenge. We have not traditionally fueled our vehicles at home. That's been a very unusual thing. If you live on a farm, maybe, but that's about it. This idea that we're not going to fuel our vehicles at home, that's a big power and energy challenge for residential construction we have not had in the past. That's why it gets its own box. It's its own challenge, how we integrate that. The other stuff, you know, why don't we just do it all, right? It seems pretty simple. The first reason we don't do it all is because it's not cheap. These are the results of a project we did a few years ago where we looked at thousands and thousands of homes where they had tried to save carbon and save energy. And to get to reasonably high carbon savings in the order of, like, say, halving the carbon emissions of your home, you had to spend like $50,000. And that's in 2019. You can add about 25% of that for the intervening 4 years. Typical projects they combined some basic things for older homes that needed air sealing and insulating. They did that. They put in heat pumps. They added solar PV. And this is where they ended up. The problem with $50,000 is not enough households have that to get to scale. Just for context, the median household savings in the country is about $5,000 per household. So we're at 10 times that. People are not just going to write a $50,000 check. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't. The other critical issue is that high cost. If I go back a little bit, you see the bars there are pretty wide. There's a big range of costs. And it has to do with, it depends what the home is like when you get there. If you already have air conditioning, it's trivial to add a heat pump. And as I said to the students earlier today, if I was king, I would never sell another air conditioner. Everything would have a reversing valve. Everyone would get a heat pump at the end. That would be the lowest cost, biggest impact thing we could ever do. We should probably do it tomorrow. It's effectively free. It's so low cost. It would have a massive impact. But, you know, there's things like new homes, as I mentioned, they're pretty well insulated. My old 110-year-old home in Alameda wasn't. It is now. But for older homes, we have that additional expense. If you've got to air seal and insulate them. I mentioned we're adding some new loads that we have not traditionally added, but not everybody's going to do it. And that is a huge variable. Then you get into things like you go to a house and you look at the heating system and all the ducts are covered in asbestos. Well, if you're the contractor, you now have an additional cost. If you're the homeowner, you have an additional cost of dealing with the existing problems in buildings. I picked an asbestos because it's an obvious one and relatively common. There are all sorts of others. But the key issue to this upfront cost that is a real challenge, particularly in California, because we have our gassy homes, is this idea of replacing our electric panels and the service drop we get from the utility. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that for the next few minutes. So a great question is, why don't we just do it? And the short answer is, looking at all these numbers, is it costs a lot of money. It's adding thousands and thousands of dollars to every single project if this is what we wanted to do. There are also enormous time delays. All the electricians I know are super busy. It's very, very hard to get one. Even if you can get one, depending on which utility you're dealing with in the state, you can have many, many months of project delays. And if you're a contractor trying to sell a job to a homeowner, all these delays, all these questions, all this extra paperwork, it's just a killer for sealing the deal. It's incredibly difficult to persuade people when you have to tell them, well, it could be 6 to 9 months, maybe a year. Nobody wants to hear that. It's tough for contractors with all these time delays. And lastly, and I think also important, if we were to simply say, well, every home is going to get a new panel and a service drop, well, the utilities have to respond to that. They would have to add new transformers, maybe change out wires, both locally and on the larger distribution network. They would have to account for that and build a lot more power plants. And all of those costs are passed on to you and me, the ratepayers, in future higher rates on your bills. There is no free lunch here, right? If we upgrade all the homes to have a lot of power in them, there's going to be enormous future costs, and we really, really have to avoid that if we can. So a question might be, you know, how often we do this, and does it matter very much? So I'll talk about that a little bit. The main drivers of these sort of new things, honestly, it's solar PV and EV charging that drives a lot of this work. It's not necessarily swapping out heat pumps, which is kind of good news, right? It tells us we can save a lot of CO2 without having these costs. We do have the National Electric Code. There's a picture of the cover of it. I won't go through all the details in there because they are quite complex, sometimes not easy to follow, which is why there are pathways in the National Electric Code that would let you do things easily, but they're rarely followed because they're not easy to follow. It's hard for authorities having jurisdiction, which is your local code enforcement folks, to really know about compliance if you take these alternative paths. We're working on that, by the way. Me and my team, we're working with the folks who write the NEC to make it a little easier to follow. But even if it's in the NEC, it doesn't mean your local authority will accept it. And this is definitely an issue where there are things we want to do with electrification that some cities like, no, don't like it. Even if you point at the words in the National Electric Code that says it's okay. So you might call it an educational, maybe it's an acceptance barrier, maybe it's a risk barrier. Those are not technical things, but they're vastly important because if the city won't let you electrify your home for various reasons, you won't be able to electrify it. The next issue is about operating costs. And I've got a couple of maps here. The top map is saying, how good a heat pump do you need to have to break even from, say, a CO2 emissions point of view, to be CO2 neutral? And we can focus on California here. It's nice and green, which means we don't need very good efficiency because we have got really low CO2. And in fact, in California, you could use electric resistance heat. Please don't, but you could. And you would still break even. You could swap out a gas furnace for electric resistance heat. If you have a heat pump, you get to 3 times better than this and you're laughing. So California, relatively easy. But the bottom map is looking at bill neutrality. So this is accounting for the cost difference between gas and electric. And there it's far more challenging in California, far more challenging. You would have to do a bunch of other things, like make sure all the ducts get sealed and insulated. Or if you live in an older home, you'd want to definitely do things like insulate the envelope if it's not insulated and do some air sealing. So if we want to be careful about bills, we have to understand that. And we have to know that there are other things you would have to do rather than simply replacing like for like with a heat pump for a furnace. You need to do some other things. It's all totally doable. I've done it at my house, but it's not intrinsically obvious. The other issue is that people have a lot of questions, and they're all reasonable questions. Like we're asking people, whether it's contractors or homeowners, to do something very different. And they ask reasonable things like, will my bills go up or down? Is it noisy? Who'll fix it when it breaks? These are real things that we are going to have to deal with if we're going to get to scale, right? It's going to have to be trivially easy to find someone to install and service a heat pump, even if you live in a part of the state where traditionally that has not happened. Currently, that's quite a challenge. Right? We have to think about things like, I mentioned project delays here. How long is it going to take to do this, right? How long do I have to wait? And I think the last one has to do with something we've talked about for many years in the energy efficiency business, which is, if I do this to my home, will my home's value go up or down? For most people, a home is the biggest single investment they'll ever make. It's very, very important for them that they're not damaging the value of a home if they do the sort of crazy stuff I'm going to advocate to save the planet. These are very reasonable questions, and we don't always have good answers. But when we're thinking about setting policy, we need to set policies that address these questions that people have. Otherwise, they won't do it, and we will never get to scale. Even if we could persuade everyone in the state, this is a great idea to decarbonize, there are definitely not enough people to do the work by a long, long way. And in fact, nationally, we have fewer plumbers and electricians every year. People are retiring out, not being replaced. Big challenge. We need to somehow persuade many, many more young people to go into the trades. It's a challenge. There's a lot of work being done in this area, by the way. There's also the issue that I'm showing in the chart here, which is more, should we say, about business practices. We'll get into this shortly, where if we look at the overhead associated with work on buildings and new construction, overheads are pretty tight. You know, there's not a lot of slack there. These are often the companies that build new homes, are often larger companies, and they have systems in place where they can minimize it. But the bar that's on the far right there was the basis of a survey that we did a few years ago, looking specifically at energy retrofits of buildings. Energy retrofits have got massive overheads because it's just very difficult. It's harder to do. It's harder to close the deal. And there's a bunch of other things that mean that there's a huge amount of overhead in the work we want to do. We're really going to have to squash that part of this little bar. We're going to have to make it the easy, trivial thing to do. So I've talked about problems enough. Let's think about some pathways to deal with some of these and some of the solutions. So currently, home decarbonization, if you just went home today and wanted to do it, it's costly, it's time consuming, and it's hard. And if it stays that way, we won't do it. It needs to be affordable, simple, and easy, right? And I've put together sort of a pathway here that, based on what we know about the industry, what we know about various technologies that are available, and what we know about how practical it is to do things, is probably how we bridge that gap. And the thing that I labeled number one there, the start now if not soon enough, maybe that should have been labeled 0. We don't have time to wait. It's already much, much too late to start, in fact. And so we don't have to wait for things to be absolutely perfect, right? There's a lot of stuff we can do now. Not all homes are going to be fixed today. This is going to take many years. So it's okay to say, we'll deal with that later. I want to emphasize that there's a lot we can do now. We should do it. I touched on these ideas about older homes putting air sealing and insulating. We have the technologies to electrify the big energy users, which is basically heating and hot water. I mean, you might want to add solar PV. That's got a little trickier with new net energy metering policies, which I'm not going to talk about today. That's maybe a conversation for another day. We're not doing very much solar installation in California anymore for obvious reasons. That's going to be a challenge. But there are things like, if you're running a program that's installing heat pumps, it's worth every penny to buy a higher performance heat pump, because it's almost always dominated by installation costs. So the additional cost to buy a high rated heat pump is small in comparison to what you get back for it. And this is particularly critical in programs aimed at low income. Historically, low income programs have sort of done the minimum possible. And I'm advocating for not doing that in the future. We have to take say a slightly longer term view. Maybe we should be installing the very best heat pumps we can find in low income apartments because of the rewards you get down the road in terms of lower electric use, lower CO2 emissions, lower bills, and just overall better performance. And there's a couple of other things in this list that I've not touched on, but we might get to later, which is there's a whole bunch of other benefits that we should start talking about. Not everyone is convinced that we need to save our civilization. But they may be convinced by if we tell them, well, we're going to install something that is quieter, it's more comfortable, it provides a healthier environment for you and your family. And these are things that will make people make a decision quite often, more so than something that frankly is kind of abstract for most people. So I want to talk a little bit on this topic of low power electrification for a couple of reasons. One thing is it's probably vital if we're going to avoid massive future costs, if we're going to avoid the massive delays waiting for infrastructure to be built out and so on. And we're going to do that by thinking about power, not just energy use. That first bullet is associated with all those costs I talked about, replacing panels and replacing the service you get from the utility. You could save something like $3,000 to $20,000 per job. It's significant, right? I talked about reducing future operating costs. It reduces delays. We have nice things like, what I mean by emergency replacement is, let's say the gas water heater has failed in your home. How long do you want to wait for hot water? Maybe a day, right? Tops. But if you have to wait 6 weeks for an electrician to come to install a brand new 240 volt piece of wiring and junction boxes to connect your heat pump water heater, that's not going to happen, right? So if we can switch to low power devices, in this case, 120 volt, 15 amp heat pump water heaters that are just coming on the market, you can do that switch much easier in this emergency replacement thing. A little trickier for heat pumps to heat your home, because although there are some low capacity ones, which are great for smaller homes and multifamily, probably won't work for a typical home, but we need to, figure out this problem of what happens in an emergency. Right now, the answer is you put in another fossil fuel burning appliance. Well, we probably have to stop that. But it's easy to say, but if we're going to say we're going to stop it, we need the technologies in place. We need the strategies in place to let us do it. There's also issues about load reduction. I talked a bit about air sealing and insulating of homes. We need to air seal and insulate our ducts too. They've been programmed for such a long time in the state. So this is nothing new. We just need to make sure we do it, right? And this has all sorts of ways of impacting things. If you buy a physically smaller, lower capacity device, it's lower power, takes up less space, it's cheaper to operate, and so on. I will say, though, that having gone through this list, the incentive for contractors, the people who are doing the work, there's not a lot of incentive for them to do these things. I would say maybe the only one that is an incentive is if a contractor can say, I can fix your problem tomorrow doing this instead of waiting 6 weeks. That's an interesting thing for a contractor. The other stuff, not so much. And so, there are challenges here that are economic from the point of view of if you're an electrician. There's money to be made replacing people's electric panels and rewiring. And I'm going to stand up in front of a room sometimes of electricians and say, I don't want you to make that money anymore. Well, that's not so easy. I don't have a particular solution to that problem, but it's something we need to consider, because none of this will happen unless there are successful businesses doing it, right? I don't think the state of California is going to say, okay, the state's going to hire 120,000 people to do all this work. It's going to be the installed contractor base that does it. We have to make these things attractive for them too. Another thing is that this whole issue of these costs about and concerns people have about power and panel replacement, maybe we don't have to do it so much at all, because this is some data from our friends at Home Energy Analytics looking at what was the peak power draw in homes. And it turns out that most homes' peak power is way, way below their installed capacity, which is good news, right? It means there are lots of opportunities to not do those expensive things and not have those wait times. Furthermore, this is some California stuff. It's even true nationally. This is another database we put together nationally. And the vertical lines there are showing some sort of typical installed capacities. The black line is the median for something like the 10,000 homes we had in the database. The yellow line is a typical 100 amp panel, which is what we often are concerned about. And 200 amps, which is what you get in new construction, almost no homes reach that. So we have a lot of scope here. This is something we can actually do. But people do ask questions from, say, more of a policy point of view, like, okay, if we have, if we switch from rebating panels to rebating low power things, you know, is that changing the demographics of the people who actually are going to be eligible for these things and so on? So these are just a couple of charts that look at things like, how likely are you going to be to need these things? And it turns out, interestingly, age doesn't matter. We had in our brains when we originally did this, we thought, oh, older homes are going to absolutely have higher requirements, but not. It turns out a lot of older homes have had their electric systems replaced or fixed over the years. And it's a bit squishy. There's a lot of variability, as you can see, but generally speaking, age doesn't matter. House size does, though. Bigger homes want more power. They get bigger air conditioners and heat pumps. They often get bigger water heaters. So all those things that imply more power, you're going to find in bigger homes. So there are some issues about if we have subsidies for replacing panels, which we currently do, who's getting those subsidies? People with big homes. It's a short answer. And the last thing on that topic is there's a great amount of data being made publicly available by the Tech Clean program here in California. I encourage you all to go and look it up. Just awesome. And for a researcher, it's like, wow, they've done my job for me. I could just spend hours browsing their data. I just wanted to pick some of the information off our database where they're looking at heat pump water heater replacements. They find that out of more than 20,000 projects, only something like 6% had to go and do something associated with the panel and the service drop. Because as I mentioned earlier, the heat pumps we're installing are not necessarily the high power problematic loads. Oddly, again, this was a head scratcher for us. We thought, oh, almost all these upgrades will be from the old 100 amp panels to 200 amp panels, make it look like new construction. Not at all. It was going from 200 to 300 amp panels. And that's because they were driven often by other things. And just to make the point, there's no California thing. Our friends at Cadmus who did a cold climate air source heat pump study found similar numbers for replacement. So the point here is the devices that are emitting the CO2 that use the most energy are not the ones that are critical here from a high power and high load perspective. And the change outs are often driven by other things. And the question from a public policy point of view is, what is it we want to prioritize? Which households are benefiting the most and so on. And we have a whole host of solutions to never do any of these things again. The reason why I think these are important is everything I've talked about up to now was about increasing the maximum power a home might draw based on the power available in the electric panel and the service drop. But if you're a utility, you also want to know what is the actual maximum power draw, not what could the house draw ever, but what does it typically draw? And so these are some solutions that allow us to control that. There are things like smart panels where you can set a power limit. There's circuit sharing, which is usually these days that's between electric vehicles and clothes dryers, because we believe we can pause our electric vehicle charging without very much pain. The circuit pauses do similar things. And there's a whole bunch of other solutions which are kind of in a similar vein. The thing is, these all have currently very small market shares. But if I was a utility who wanted to limit my future liability for how many power plants I have to build, how many transformers do I have to replace, I'd be encouraging all of this stuff, right? I would not be paying people to put in a bigger electric panel. I'd be paying people to do these things because that's going to limit the peak power draw on the system. And these are, quote unquote, readily available. You can go and get them now. This is not future technology. You can buy it now. They're just very rarely used, right? And as I mentioned earlier, not all cities will let you do it. In particular, some of these solutions here, where you're sharing a circuit between two devices, not always allowed. So we need to work not just on technical solutions, but how they get implemented also. And just one more slide on this. Question people always ask me is, if I'm going to share a circuit between two devices, and I apologize for the small print here, a lot of these are at the top there, sharing your hot tub power. Now, that's only applying in a small subset of homes, I would argue. The thing I've highlighted is the classic clothes dryer, sharing an outlet with the electric vehicle. How often is this a problem? Because you don't want the things paused in your house on a regular basis. That might become inconvenient. And boy, oh boy, we are not going to save the planet if we inconvenience people even a tiny amount, is what we have learned. You cannot inconvenience people. It will not be acceptable. So how much inconvenience is a good question. And it turns out, this is based on several thousand homes we have in a database. We're talking about 40 minutes a week is when you're charging your EV, but you want to dry some clothes and the EV gets paused for 40 minutes. That's probably acceptable, right? I'm not so concerned about the hot tub and the water heater. I mean, we'll, grin and bear it. So you have to sit in the hot tub for an extra hour or something. That's probably survivable, right? We're probably going to fix the NEC, but to make it more understandable. But I just want to point out that our friends at Redwood Energy and Tom Kabat and those folks, they've put together this thing called the Watt Diet that sort of steps you through this process. It's absolutely fantastic. But the point being that we don't need to do very much to be able to do low power electrification in a way that is going to be code compliant and safe and all those good things that you want. I will point out, though, that one initiative we're working on is that currently the electric code says you have to have recorded data every 15 minutes to take this low power compliance path. But most metered data that you can get from utilities every 60 minutes. I'm like, what? These two worlds have collided. So we're working on ways, we're putting in a conversion factor, hopefully in the NEC shortly, that will account for some of that. There are other policies, like maybe just flat out do some cost compression, right? This is a traditional approach, engineering approach, these sort of things. So instead of buying an 80-gallon heat pump water heater, you buy a 50-gallon heat pump water heater. That shaves, like $1,000 or more off the price right there. Use a mixing valve if you're a high water using household, so you let the water get hotter in the tank, but you don't scald yourself. And then you can try all these strategies about cost reduction. This is a classic way a classic engineering way to approach these problems. And people have tried it out right here in Sacramento. Your local utility, SMUD, has actually successfully done some of these things and was able to cut out, about 15 to 20% off the cost of installs just with some simple cost compression strategies. I mentioned earlier, none of this will get done unless we have successful businesses. This is sort of the swirl of death that we have and how we might address it. Why is it so expensive? Right? Why are costs so high? The costs are high because overheads are high. And why are overheads high? Overheads are high because it's really hard to close these deals. If you talk to contractors doing it, they're competing with other contractors who are just like, I'm just going to put a furnace in for you. And it's going to cost this. Very difficult. And the high cost leads to lack of consumer demand, and you end up with this spiral of doom. And the things around the periphery are the sort of policies and other things that we can do to try and break this circle, right? We need to have successful businesses to do all the work, and they're currently trapped in this. They have massive overheads, and this is why we've got to fix that. Challenging, but I think some of these ideas are going to address that. Also, we could talk a little bit about marketing. The illustration I have here is from our friends at Quick Carbon, who recently did training for PG&E for contractors on this exact topic about things like, if you're trying to sell home electrification, do you have a little thing here that says, upgrade your home with renewables? Or do you put a smiling human being in the picture? Those of you who know anything about marketing know that this is far, far more successful than that. And this seems trivial, right? But the buildings industry is quirky. I'll call it old-fashioned. It doesn't market itself well. It just doesn't. And we need to get way, way better at that. We need to help businesses to sort of build this up. And I've just got a couple more topics I want to touch on here. I mentioned this earlier. Not everyone is convinced that our civilization will get saved by reducing carbon emissions, right? So we have to talk about other stuff. Again, this is kind of marketing in a way, but to get to scale, we need to understand it. And we need to have policies in place that encourage it. So we talk about things like functionality, like how much better is it to have a heat pump? They're quiet, they're comfortable, all that sort of thing. Then there's health and safety, which actually my team at LBL has done quite a bit of work on. Issues about not burning stuff in your house can have big advantages. Now, admittedly, the biggest advantages are for cooking and for unvented heaters because they vent into the space and you breathe all the contaminants, right? But even if you have a properly vented water heater or a furnace. It's putting contaminants outside, it becomes more of a public health issue. And then here in California, we have regulated a lot of this historically already. We require, and have required for a long time, low NOx burners on water heaters, for example, because of problems with outdoor air pollution. So when we electrify, there's a whole bunch of these sort of public health issues that might be persuasive for people who are not persuaded by saving our civilization. And there's also big challenges remaining for multifamily and low-income households. And I mean, and some of this is incredibly practical. If we were going to do a traditional gut rehab on a building, everyone's got to leave. Well, that's not so great, right? Who wants to move out for a few months while the building is rehabilitated? Is there any guarantee you can return? Will your rent go up? And I work with nonprofits who face this every day. We currently do not regulate that particularly well in the state, if at all. And probably we need something to deal with that. It would be great if we had more what I would call transportable solutions, where you sort of plug and play something and plug into just a regular outlet rather than having hardwired to a building. Because if you're a renter and you're moving in 2 years, might be wanting to take that with you rather. And lastly, there's issues about going from central to decentralized systems, where the bill was in your rent and now it's not. This creates some crazy disincentives. We also have to think a little bit about leaks. What do I mean by that? So methane leaks out of the gas distribution system. Turns out methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. We have to remove the distribution network. That's another big challenge. Nobody wants to be the last person on the distribution network, right? So we're going to have to face that as a state. And I will say that the state is already trying to address this as various issues being run by utilities who are working on how do we do whole neighborhoods at all. Some homes will be hard to electrify, and I have to plug here. There's a DOE prize, the EASY prize. They're specifically looking at the harder to electrify homes. So not the easy stuff, the hard stuff. They're looking, 5 years down the road once we've done the easy homes. How do you get the hard ones? There's a lot of work being done to address these things. So I just have a couple of minutes left, and the rest of my slides are basically summary slides. I think there are some technical challenges. We still have a bit of a noise issue with heat pump water heaters. There are issues about, this is the thing you have to maintain. People are not used to maintaining it. How to get people used to that? Particularly multifamily, modern heat pump water heaters are very tall and they won't fit. So you can't install it. It won't actually fit in the closet. We need some new form factors, right? We're concerned about refrigerants, but I think there's a lot of work being doing on that, particularly by Department of Energy. There's a lot of international efforts to try and deal with that. There are issues with controls where, particularly for heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, there can be a black box. Not even the installers know what's in them. We need to work with manufacturers to fix that because it does lead to some pretty poor problems. And then there's things like, I mentioned, changes in maintenance. People have to figure stuff out. Like we've trained everyone to set back their thermostats at night in the winter so the house gets cold to save energy. Don't do that with a high performance heat pump, because when it comes on in the morning, it goes into maximum output. If you have electric resistance in there, it turns it on. It goes to minimum efficiency and maximum power. Don't do it. But we have to undo, we've been doing this since about 1978, we have to undo 50 years of telling people that nighttime setback's a great idea. That is massively challenging. Okay. So just quickly, a few policy observations. I've mentioned this a lot. We have to think about what we do with our rebates. I would rather shift away from rebating, putting high power stuff and replacing panels, into rebating all the other things I talked about, right? We've really got to deal with EV charging. City of Palo Alto already has a huge problem. They can't do any more home electrification because all their power got used up by early adopters of EVs who put in 50 kilowatt home chargers that you don't need. And they're already saying no to any more home electrification. They ran out of power. They're going to have to run a whole bunch of new wires, new transformers. It's a nightmare. It already happened. So please never install a high power EV charger. We've got to think about, incentivizing all these things. There's sort of a laundry list that I've got. This is how we will do it in a low power way that's kind of the grid. We'll minimize all the future expense, probably minimizes the expense right now. These are things we currently don't do, but I think we should do. I touched on this equity issue, particularly the the old split incentive problem was if you owned a building and you rented it out, if the building got upgraded, you didn't see the low electric bill. That was the old one. The new problem is if we have replacing central systems that are included in people's rent with systems in individual units where now you're paying the electric bill yourself. It's sort of that split incentive, but the other way around, right? And that's a huge challenge, particularly when we're concerned about low-income households in multifamily and not increasing their bills. We've got to have programs that work for all households. And this is a real challenge. DOE has got specific programs in place to try and deal with this. There's issues like rebates work better, not tax credit, particularly for low-income homes. We have some other regulation challenges, that we have to fix. Building codes don't let you in. It was incredibly difficult. I have a single family home. It should be trivial, right? We couldn't find anywhere outside to put my outside unit of the heat pump because of things that has to be so many feet from the property line, blah, 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 blah. There's the green book that the utility has that restrict a lot of things you can do. That probably needs to be updated. There's things like time of use rates. And this is sort of the last technical thing I'll show you, then I'll take some questions. Currently, we encourage people to charge their EVs at night. There's an EV rate, but that's when the carbon content of the electricity is highest. We need an EV charge rate that says charge now, actually, middle of the day, right? Same thing with water heaters, right? Currently, our time of use rates sort of do the opposite of what we want because they're based on the cost of energy, not on carbon content. So I'm asking people to change to a carbon content thing. Similarly, some of you are probably familiar with this thing called the duck curve. It's showing that our renewables all happen in the middle of the day and not the rest of the day, and that's problematic for the grid. Well, we should be using all that renewable electricity to preheat water in our homes and charge our EVs. We should do all our charging during the day, not at night. And we need different incentives to do that. We need a lot more public charger infrastructure. We need to be able to charge at work. And we need rates that reward people for charging at home. And I'll just finish up here. We need to make changes right now. It's far too late to wait. Better things are coming, but there's so much we can do right now that hopefully the examples I've given you, we'll talk about that. We need to get people to want it, and it has to be not risky for homeowners and contractors. People have to believe it's all going to work. We need to really, really get a lot more people involved in this industry. We simply don't have enough folks around. We've got to tackle some of the affordability issues, and there's classic cost compression and avoiding expensive things I think will help there. There's new products that we need, and we can do a lot of homes, but not all of them. And we need our regulations simplified. And there's a few things we're going to do next. Lots of researchers are working on this. And finally, there's a lot of guidance already being developed. And I think now is the time to actually start doing it, because we just haven't done it yet. And I know I talked a lot about problems and issues, but I think we have a lot of solutions. There's a lot of stuff we can do right now without having to wait. We just need the right policies in place. We need to rebate the right things. We need to address a lot of what I would call non-technical problems, be they regulatory or workforce training or so on. So I'm going to stop there. I think we have 10 minutes or so for questions.